In the early 1620s, African slave traders kidnapped the man who would later be known as Anthony Johnson in Portuguese Angola and sold him to Portuguese slavers, who named him Antonio and sold him into the Atlantic slave trade. A colonist in Virginia acquired Antonio. As an indentured servant, Antonio worked for a merchant at the Virginia Company. He was also received into the Roman Catholic Church. Servitude in Virginia. He sailed to Virginia in 1621 aboard the James. The Virginia muster of 1624 lists his name as Antonio not given, recorded as a Negro in the notes column. Historians dispute whether this was the same Antonio later known as Anthony Johnson, as the census lists several men named Antonio. This one is considered the most likely. Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to merchant Edward Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm, Warrisquoke, on the southern bank of the James River. Slave laws were not passed until 1661 in Virginia. Before that date, Africans were not officially considered to be enslaved. Such workers typically worked under a limited indenture contract for 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage, room, board, lodging, and freedom dues. In the early colonial years, most Africans in the 13 colonies were held under such contracts of limited indentured servitude. Except for those indentured for life, they were released after a contracted period. Those who managed to survive their period of indenture would receive land and equipment after their contracts expired or were bought out. Most white laborers in this period also came to the colony as indentured servants. Antonio almost died in the Indian Massacre of 1622 when Bennett's plantation was attacked. The Powhatan, who were the indigenous people dominant at that time in the Tidewater region of Virginia, were attempting to evict the colonists. They raided the settlement where Johnson worked on Good Friday and killed 52 of the 57 men present. In 1623, a black woman named Mary arrived aboard the ship Margaret. She was brought to work on the same plantation as Antonio, where she was the only woman present. Antonio and Mary married and lived together for more than 40 years. Conclusion of indentured servitude. Sometime after 1635, Antonio and Mary concluded the terms of their indentured servitude. Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. He first entered the legal record as an unindentured man when he purchased a calf in 1647. The colonial government granted Johnson a large plot of farmland after he paid off his indentured contract by his labor. On July 24, 1651, he acquired 250 acres of land under the headright system by buying the contracts of 5 indentured servants, one of whom was his son, Richard Johnson. The headright system worked so that if a man were to bring indentured servants over to the colonies, he was owed 50 acres a head, or servant. The land was located on the Great Nasswatuck Creek, which flowed into the Pungoteague River in Northampton County, Virginia. Johnson ran a tobacco farm using indentured servants. One of those servants, John Kaser, would later become one of the first African men to be declared indentured for life. In 1652, an unfortunate fire caused great losses for the family, and Johnson applied to the courts for tax relief. The court reduced the family's taxes and, on February 28, 1652, exempted his wife Mary and their 2 daughters from paying taxes during their natural lives. At that time, taxes were levied on people, not property. Under the 1645 Virginia Taxation Act, all Negro men and women and all other men from the age of 16 to 60 shall be judged tithable. It is unclear from the records why the Johnson women were exempted, but the change gave them the same social standing as white women, who were not taxed. During the case, the justices noted that Anthony and Mary have lived inhabitants in Virginia, and had been respected for their hard labor and known service. By the 1650s, Anthony and Mary Johnson were farming 250 acres in Northampton County, while their 2 sons owned 550 acres.
When Anthony Johnson was released from his servitude, he was legally recognized as a free Negro. He became a successful farmer. In 1651, he owned 250 acres and the services of 5 indentured servants. In 1653, John Cassar, a black indentured servant whose contract Johnson appeared to have bought in the early 1640s, approached Captain Samuel Goldsmith, claiming his indenture had expired 7 years earlier and that he was being held illegally by Johnson. A neighbor, Robert Parker, intervened and persuaded Johnson to free Cassar. Handwritten court ruling. March 8, 1655. Parker offered Cassar work, and he signed a term of indenture to the planter. Johnson filed a freedom suit against Parker in the Northampton court in 1654 for the return of Cassar. The court initially found in favor of Parker, but Johnson appealed. In 1655, the court reversed its ruling. Finding that Anthony Johnson still owned John Cassar, the court ordered that he be returned with the court dues paid by Robert Parker. This was the first instance of a judicial determination in the 13 colonies holding that a person who had committed no crime could be held in servitude for life. Though Cassar was the first person who was declared an enslaved person in a civil case, there were both black and white indentured servants sentenced to lifetime servitude before him. Many historians describe indentured servant John Punch as the first documented slave in America as punishment for escaping his captors in 1640. It is considered one of the first legal cases to make a racial distinction between black and white indentured servants. Significance of Cassar lawsuit. The Cassar lawsuit demonstrates the culture and mentality of planters in the mid-17th century. Individuals made assumptions about the society of Northampton County and their place in it. According to historians T.H. Breen and Stephen Innes, Cassar believed he could form a stronger relationship with his patron, Robert Parker, than Anthony Johnson had developed over the years with his patrons. Cassar considered the dispute to be a matter of patron-client relationship, and this wrongful assumption resulted in his losing his case in court and having the ruling against him. Johnson knew that the local justices shared his fundamental belief in the sanctity of property. The judge sided with Johnson, although in future legal issues, race played a more prominent role. The Cassar lawsuit was an example of how difficult it was for Africans who were indentured servants to prevent being reduced to slavery. Most Africans could not read and had almost no knowledge of the English language. Planters found it easy to force them into slavery by refusing to acknowledge the completion of their indentured contracts. This is what happened in Johnson versus Parker. Although 2 white planters confirmed that Cassar had completed his indentured contract with Johnson, the court still ruled in Johnson's favor. Later life. 1666 Mark of Anthony Johnson. In 1657, Johnson's neighbor, Edmund Scarborough, allegedly forged a letter in which Johnson acknowledged a debt. Whether this debt was real or not is unknown. Johnson did not contest the case. Johnson was illiterate and could not have written the letter. Nevertheless, the court awarded Scarborough 100 acres of Johnson's land to pay off his alleged debt. In this early period, free blacks enjoyed relative equality with the white community. About 20% of free black Virginians owned their own homes. In 1662, the Virginia colony passed a law that children in the colony were born with the social status of their mother, according to the Roman principle of pardus sequitur ventrum. This meant that the children of slave women were born into slavery, even if their fathers were free, European, Christian, and white. This was a reversal of English common law, which held that the children of English subjects took the status of their father. The Virginian colonial government expressed the opinion that since Africans were not Christians, common law could not and did not apply to them. Anthony Johnson moved his family to Somerset County, Maryland in 1665, where he negotiated a lease on a 300-acre plot of land for 99 years. He developed the property as a tobacco farm, which he named Torrey's Vineyard. Mary survived, and in 1672, she bequeathed a cow to each of her grandsons. Research indicates that when Johnson died in 1670, his plantation was given to a white colonist, not to Johnson's children. A judge had ruled that he was not a citizen of the colony because he was black. In 1677, Anthony and Mary's grandson, John Jr., purchased a 44-acre farm, which he named Angola. John Jr. died without leaving an heir, however. By 1730, the Johnson family had vanished from historical significance. Genealogical research suggests that some of Anthony's other descendants moved to Delaware and then to North Carolina.